Hello and good day to everyone. My name is Kyle Garland and I'm from the Joint Special Operations University located in Tampa, Florida. I want to welcome everyone to another online interview of Think JSOW. Think JSOW is an ongoing series that explores research and publications of JSOW faculty, resident senior fellows, leading academics, and the wider SOF and international security community. The online collection includes interviews with authors and researchers and is intended to supplement publications, articles, and other active discussions. I encourage you to explore the complete Think JSOW collection by subscribing for announcements and reviewing our online offerings on YouTube, Facebook, LinkedIn, and the All Partner Access Network. Today, as part of our scholarly research and publication collection, we are exploring the topic of strategic influence. We are honored to be able to interview Dr. Paul Lieber. Dr. Lieber recently published a paper titled Rethinking Communication Influence from a Strategic Communication Approach. Dr. Lieber is an award-winning scholar and practitioner in global strategic communication and mass communication influence. He is a resident senior fellow at United States Special Operations Command's Joint Special Operations University. He served as the command writer for 2 U.S. SOCOM commanders and the strategic communication advisor to the commander of Special Operations Command, Australia. Dr. Lieber holds a PhD in Mass Communications and Public Affairs and a Master's of Mass Communications from Louisiana State University. Dr. Lieber, thank you very much for joining us today. I'd like to ask you to begin with an overview of your paper for our audience, please.
Sure, Kyle. Thanks for having me here today. The paper was actually a follow-on to a lecture that I provided to the Strategic Multi-Layer Assessment Group, which is a research initiative out of the Joint Staff focused on influence and with a little dash of strategic communication. The purpose of the paper, it's a pretty shorter form paper rather, that is. It's about 10 pages, looks at the intersection between strategic communication and influence, specifically how the two can be used in tandem to create better effects, where strengths and also limitations exist for current practices within strategic communication and also in influence operations, and importantly, what peer competitors are doing better in some instances than we are doing in tackling this problem set. So within the paper, and in contrast to other approaches to this topic, I made a very deliberate attempt to not admire the problem, if you will. There's been a lot of discussion at present and in near past on really why we are struggling in the influence space, and also too why a consistent strategic message seems to be absent from the U.S. Department of Defense and the interagency and also its partners when tackling problems such as peer competitors and also violent extremism. So what I really try to accomplish in this paper is, for starters, to provide a tangible definition to some of the terms that are most associated with strategic communication and influence, and also to describe how those terms, more importantly, how strategies and tactics can be better implemented to address the challenges that we're facing from peer competitors and also from, as I mentioned, violent extremists who are using these tools, especially in the online space, to gain strategic footholds across the globe. So what the paper does is it provides specifically some examples from peer competitors, especially Russia, in how they are enacting their strategic communication efforts, why these efforts are successful, what their perceptions and paradigms are as long as those of China, and also where our efforts have unfortunately fallen a bit short. More importantly, toward the end of the paper, I provide an overview of how we can potentially do things a bit better. I do believe strongly there is a lot of opportunity waiting for us if we just shift some of our strategic focus and, more importantly, our thinking in tackling these problem sets when facing challenges from, be it peer competitors, online extremists, or those in the future we aren't yet aware of. So that pretty much is what the paper provides. And again, it's the second part of 2 parts, if you will. The first was a lecture which broke down a little bit more in terms of some of the terminology, but more from a theoretical definition if you wanted to take a look at it from that perspective. So again, I'm honored to be here to answer the questions that you have about the paper.
Well, thanks very much, Dr. Lieber. So now really on behalf of our audience, I would like to ask you a few questions. You briefly mentioned just a moment ago that we're falling behind our adversaries, particularly China and Russia. Could you explain, why and how? Why are we falling behind, and what can we do to catch up?
Well, the real culprit behind all of this is that Russia and China decided they were going to enact very deliberate strategic communication and influence initiatives years before we even acknowledged that this was going to be a challenge. So Russia, for instance, is attacking the very foundations in how we think about basic premises of society and functioning. So what they've done is, over a course of, as detailed in the paper, about a 5-year span, they went after very key infrastructure in not necessarily in communication, the ability to communicate, but how we think about communication. And they attack the very premise, the very underlying consciousness of how Americans perceive essential aspects of governance and democracy. China, what they've done is they've taken the long game. And by the long game, I'm referring to a strategic communication approach in which consistency over time equates to success. In contrast, what we've done, and it's just really the nature of, I would say, our current Department of Defense paradigm, for better or for worse, is to try to counter actions by our adversaries. Unfortunately, in the countering space, if you're looking to achieve any form of success, you're always one step behind those who you're trying to, quote, counter. And acknowledging that is unfortunately part of the problem. So the solutions that we're trying to seek for Russia and China, which again started their strategic communication and influence initiatives years before we saw this as a problem set, we're trying to play catch up, but also trying to fix the holes that we have to create a level playing field. The paper reasons, and I believe strongly, you can't do both at the same time. You have to really think differently about it.
No, I agree. So you said that China and Russia are both thinking proactively on it, where the U.S. is a little bit more reactive, and they were thinking about it before we were. But what are some of the, if you know of any, what are some of the tangible efforts that they are doing right now to get so far ahead of the United States?
Well, Russia is really the low-hanging fruit. For Russia, the things that we point to as potential flaws in our political system are really, in many ways, or most ways, if you will, products of Russian influence initiatives. For instance, the election interference, which is well known, well publicized, and unfortunately accepted as part of our political system. We actually expect peer competitors to influence our elections in the immediate and foreseeable future. They went after that, and they've created this paradigm of distrust. In tandem, they also, maybe this isn't widely known, went after our faith in the medical community through the anti-vaccination movements. That is primarily an initiative of Russian influence campaigns to have us question the legitimacy of medical institutions and our approaches to science and technology in general. The third initiative that the Russians went after, and this is really something that they mastered, was looking at social movements within the United States. It became very obvious to them after their perfecting of trolls and bots and other initiatives to try to drive discussions down particular rabbit holes that they could also use these efforts and buoy them into offline initiatives as well. So what the Russians decided very early on in proliferation, if you will, of social media is to not only limit these initiatives to online efforts, but to take them offline. So a lot of the social movements, more importantly, the ones that are creating havoc within cities and in major cities in the United States, are a product of Russian influence campaigns to try to create disruption and chaos. So if you combine all three of these efforts, we're seeing the tangible effects. We're seeing the distrust in our governance, in our science and technology initiatives, and more importantly, of each other. So if we're in this constant state of chaos for a populace, and also in terms of how we see our governance and our governments that are designed to protect us, our peer competitors are creating a tangible impact.
Okay. So now let's talk about the U.S. approach for just a moment. In your paper, in the conclusion, you recommended that we take a strategic pause. So what should the U.S. be doing, and when should we be doing it to basically improve our approach to the influence and strategic communication arena?
The strategic pause I mentioned really doesn't require much. It requires a lot of looking in the mirror, and more importantly, by our senior leadership and those advising them to accept a very realistic notion that our current methods and practices are simply not working. And this doesn't mean to sit there in a corner and feel bad about yourselves and accept defeat. More importantly, to acknowledge the fact that there are alternative ways to doing things. And part of that requires taking a very long, hard look at the organizations that are designed to attack the influence and strategic communication and problem sets, the mindsets behind the solutions that we seek, and also to decision making by leadership when they're providing counsel on how to address these initiatives. Most importantly, as mentioned in the paper, what we really need to do is accept that there are alternatives to what we are doing and embrace that. We have and I understand it and respect it, we have a culture, especially within our defense infrastructure, that we do not accept or advocate for any form of failure. I'd like to point out, I'm not indicating that we have failed in any initiative that we're doing. More importantly, we have to accept the fact that the current approaches that we are doing are not compatible with the problem sets that are inherent in current strategic communication and influence. The strategic pause that I am recommending really is a reorganization, not creating new organizations. I want to be very clear. A reorganization of the functions that execute strategic communication and influence, that bring in partners from across the interagency and also in military partnerships to really create a coherent, deliberate strategic communication and influence function that is not founded on solutions, but is more founded on a philosophy and a mindset that acknowledges once more that there are better ways to tackle this problem set. And the paper offers some solutions that we can do right now, some opportunities, more importantly, that are just ahead of us if we choose to accept these alternatives.
Okay, so would we require any additional authorities in order to make this happen?
We might. I think more so it's rethinking the authorities. Part of the biggest problem that we run into is a bifurcation between typical authorities that are inherent in influence, which is Title 10, the overt attributed communication that is intended to influence populations, and Title 50, which is the exact opposite, executed by intelligence partners. The initiatives that we're doing are unsuccessful because our peer competitors don't acknowledge these differences. And when they conduct their campaigns, they don't intentionally separate the efforts that they're doing according to overt or covert, attributed, non-attributed, and they also look at the bigger pictures. I mentioned China. China, for instance, focuses on longer-term effects. If you're separating longer-term effects into attributed and non-attributed communication, there's no way to maintain some aspect of legitimacy. Quite frankly, you're showing your hand and you're not even wanting to play poker in the first place at the same time. And your audiences are aware of that, so it immediately eliminates the legitimacy. I would say there's a lot of discussion right now in the Beltway about what additional organizations and authorities are needed to better execute influence. I don't think it's a new authority that's needed. I think it's an acceptance that our current methods, in which we provide little distinction between Title 10 defense communication in the influence and strategic communication space, and public affairs-based communication and civil affairs-based communication in these same spaces, the fact that we're combining these under the same umbrella when they all should have different intents but fit a strategic communication mindset, that's really where the authorities need to change. Most importantly, we need to accept the fact that the individuals responsible for these efforts need to have the ability to execute these in a way that can create the change that I recommend in the paper, in change not necessarily in the strategic and communication influence outcome space, but also the mindsets and paradigms that are needed to shift the ways that we think about these problem sets.
Yes. Well, you mentioned that Russia and China are very active in the influence game. You said that China is taking the longer perspective to it. So what do you see as the most important trends here in our immediate future, and then possibly a little bit beyond our immediate future, say a decade or two?
I think the biggest realization right now is that counterintelligence is alive and well in strategic communication and influence. Russia and China, since they're very good at it and a very big head start, are well aware that you can successfully manipulate these spaces by providing misdirection within it. They're seeing audiences not as individuals who are receiving messages, but also as individuals who are processing and making decisions on messages. The greatest trend we're going to see is a bit of a chess game, if you will, in the counterintelligence space, in which individuals, especially peer competitors, I don't see it as much from violent extremists because they don't have the level of sophistication and resources required to do this, and their goals and objectives are different as well. They're seeking completely different gains than peer competitors who are seeking to delegitimize in many ways the communication structures of the U.S. versus violent extremists that are seeking chaos. So for peer competitors, what they're going to do in the next, I mean, it's happening right now, but I would see in the next 5 years, definitely 2 years is more likely, really ramp up the efforts in the counterintelligence space to try to create a lot of false positives, like the examples that I gave with Russia, and also to really drive home that, those elements of distrust and discord in general amongst the American populace. And unless the United States Department of Defense and the interagency and across all the branches of government are really willing to accept that counterintelligence is alive and well in the strategic communication and influence space, we're going to struggle in really being realistic about this problem and providing appropriate resources against it.
Okay, thank you. I have one final question for you, and I hope I can phrase this correctly. But we have a lot of online presence in the United States, from Department of Defense, Department of State, obviously our services, our combatant commands. And a lot of people argue that the antidote to misinformation and disinformation is more communication. But on the other hand, you have the thought that a centralized, standard communication message is what is necessary and what is needed. So on one hand, we have everybody communicating, but yet we want to have a standardized communication message. How do we balance the two of those? Where do you what are your thoughts on limiting speech in order to keep a message centralized, but still allowing all these organizations to communicate?
Really, the irony of all of this is there really isn't a need to change very much, except to really rethink how we are communicating. There's no need to limit communication. There's no need to increase communication. But more importantly, there is a long overdue requirement, and I use requirement very deliberately here, for those responsible for communication to sit in a room on a semi-regular basis and align their messages, their intent, their audiences, and delivery criteria and conduits, and strategically align them such that the right people are talking to the right people at the right time through the right delivery methods and with the right intents, and these are being assessed. So at the end of the day, what really needs to happen is that the individuals that are responsible for communication need to stop communicating in isolation or have the belief, as you pointed out, that more communication or less communication is better. At the end of the day, you are going to achieve the most success if the right person is communicating at the right time to the right people and in a method that they deem as most credible. And what we really need right now are individuals at the highest levels of government believing and endorsing this, not necessarily directing the organizations or the outcomes, but getting people in a room and discussing the very concept that we have a known strategic communication and influence gap, and the best way to potentially address it is by aligning our efforts in a systematic, deliberate way that will achieve, by just default, better gains than what we have right now.
Thank you, Dr. Lieber. From my perspective, I've been hearing for many years that the United States is behind our adversaries when it comes to strategic communication. But as you mentioned in your paper, there's no mention of influence in strategic communication in the most recent national defense strategy. So this is obviously a topic that needs to be discussed at the highest levels, and I think your paper provides a great strategic overview of where we are and where we need to go. But before we close today, I'd like to just give the podium back over to you. Do you have any final comments you'd like to share on this topic before we close?
Yeah, I'd like to build off your last comment. And the biggest challenge that we're facing is we're creating our own problems in trying to solve the problem. What I've tried to do in this paper is answer the questions that we've discussed here and a lot of the topics that we've raised by providing tangible definitions to a lot of the problems that we are facing. amazingly, in everyone's attempt to solve the problem, we haven't been willing to provide definitions that we all could potentially accept and work off of, because by doing so, accepts the limitations of the current approaches. And also, I believe that individuals in leadership capacities for organizations that are responsible for strategic communication influence, if they would accept a standardized definition, they may see that as some admission of failure in what they're doing. I don't believe that's the case, but by accepting that there are ways to define these problem sets, I think we can really begin to start tackling them in the future.
Great. Thank you again, Dr. Lieber, for sharing your time and expertise with us today. I believe your discussion was extremely educational and I believe helpful to today's Special Operations Forces. Upcoming topics on Think JSOW include authors from the U.S. SOCOM Commander's Reading List, as well as current research conducted by JSOW faculty and senior fellows. For feedback on Think JSOW or to nominate potential speakers, please contact us at thinkjsow@socom.mil. In the meantime, you can follow JSOW on LinkedIn and Facebook, or you can check out our upcoming courses and events on our website, which is www.socom.mil/JSOU. This series is brought to you by the Department of Strategic Studies of the Joint Special Operations University. Thank you all very much for listening.